The voicemail was from my mother, the first time she'd called in 3 years. "Sweetheart, we saw the news about your lottery win. We're so proud of you. When can we come visit?" I stared at my phone, remembering how they'd handed my grandfather's farm to my sister while I was deployed overseas, telling me a veteran's salary would never be enough to maintain it anyway. My name is Isabella Martinez, and this is the story of how my family erased me from their lives until money made me worth remembering again. It's a story about a 200-acre farm in rural Texas that my grandfather built with his own hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, about parents who chose financial convenience over family loyalty, and about a lottery ticket that exposed just how shallow blood really runs. When I returned from my 3rd deployment in Afghanistan, I expected to come home to the farm that had been promised to me since childhood. Instead, I found my sister Carmen living in my grandfather's house, her name on the deed, acting like she'd always been the rightful heir. My parents sat me down in the kitchen where I'd learned to cook tamales with my grandmother and explained their decision with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "Carmen has a stable marriage and a reliable income," my mother said, not meeting my eyes. "She can maintain the property. You're still figuring things out." Figuring things out. That's what they called 6 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and a chest full of medals. I'd never shown them because they'd never asked. That's what they called the nights I'd spent awake in foxholes, dreaming of coming home to the land that had shaped me, the place where my grandfather had taught me to ride horses and fix engines, and believe that family meant something permanent. But Carmen had married a real estate developer. Carmen had a business degree. Carmen had never left Texas, never missed a family dinner, never chosen duty to country over Sunday barbecues. Carmen was safe, predictable, profitable. I was a risk they weren't willing to take. The farm wasn't just land, it was legacy. 200 acres of rolling hills, a creek that ran clear year-round, cattle pastures my great-grandfather had cleared by hand. The farmhouse where 4 generations of my family had been born, where my grandfather had died holding my hand, whispering promises about keeping the land in the family forever. It was supposed to be mine. Everyone had always said so. Until everyone decided it shouldn't be. Lo de veritur Hedzibels. I moved into a tiny apartment in San Antonio, close enough to see the farm when I drove the back roads on sleepless nights, far enough away that my family could pretend I didn't exist. I worked construction during the day, did security at night, saved every penny while watching Carmen renovate my grandfather's house through social media posts I wasn't supposed to see. She painted over his wood paneling, ripped out my grandmother's rose garden, turned the barn into a wedding venue for her friends. Medio and my parents became strangers overnight. Phone calls stopped. Holiday invitations disappeared. When my father needed surgery, I found out through a neighbor. When my mother celebrated her 60th birthday, the photos showed Carmen cutting cake in my grandfather's dining room, while I worked a double shift to pay rent on a place that would never be home. For 3 years, I existed in their peripheral vision, close enough to remind them of their choice, invisible enough that they could live with it. They'd chosen their golden daughter and left me to build a life from whatever scraps remained of my military savings and wounded pride. But money has a funny way of changing people's vision. Suddenly, after 3 years of silence, that lottery ticket worth $47 million made me visible again. Suddenly, I was family. Suddenly, they were proud. Suddenly, they wanted to visit. The same parents who'd handed my inheritance to my sister because they thought I was unstable were now calling me sweetheart. Talking about how they'd always believed in me, asking when they could come see my new house. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it wasn't surprising. I'd learned long ago that love in my family came with conditions, and the biggest condition of all was success they could understand, and money they could benefit from. Carmen had always been the golden child, but after getting the farm, she became untouchable. While I struggled to make rent in my cramped apartment, she hosted elaborate dinner parties in my grandfather's dining room, the one where he'd taught me to play dominoes and told me stories about building the ranch from nothing. She posted photos on social media of her perfect life. Farmers market brunches on the wraparound porch, wine tastings in the converted barn, Her husband's business partners touring the property like it was their personal country club. My parents' Facebook pages became shrines to Carmen's success. Photo after photo of family gatherings I wasn't invited to, holiday celebrations happening in rooms where my childhood memories lived, captions praising their responsible daughter and her wise stewardship of the family legacy. When Carmen announced her pregnancy, my mother posted a picture of the farm with the caption, "So blessed that our grandchild will grow up where 4 generations of our family have thrived." 4 generations, as if I'd never existed at all. When new, the family values they celebrated had nothing to do with sacrifice or service or loyalty. They valued stability, which meant staying close to home. They valued success, which meant making money in ways they could understand and brag about to their church friends. They valued respectability, which meant following the path they'd mapped out rather than the one that called to your heart. Carmen embodied everything they wanted in a daughter. She'd married young to someone they approved of, someone whose family owned half the county, and whose business brought prestige to their social circle. She'd never challenged their authority, never chosen a path that made them uncomfortable, never forced them to explain to neighbors why their daughter was shooting at insurgents in Afghanistan instead of shooting weddings in Austin. At family gatherings I learned about through mutual friends, Carmen held court like a queen. She'd hired a management company to run the cattle operation, turning my grandfather's working ranch into a profitable investment. She'd partnered with a wedding planning business, transforming the barn where I'd learned to drive into a rustic venue for city couples wanting an authentic country experience. She'd even started selling plots for a subdivision on the back 40, the same land where my grandfather had taught me to hunt, and where I'd dreamed of building my own house someday. Every business decision was praised as innovative and forward-thinking. Every dollar earned was proof of her wisdom and vision. She was turning a sentimental old farm into a modern enterprise, and my parents couldn't be prouder. At church, they bragged about their entrepreneur daughter, who was maximizing the property's potential. At the grocery store, they handed out business cards for Carmen's wedding venue like proud campaign managers. Meanwhile, I was the daughter they explained away. If forced to mention me at all, I was Isabella, she's in the army, or later, Isabella, she's figuring herself out. Never Isabella, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Never Isabella, who earned a Bronze Star. Never Isabella, who sacrificed 6 years of her life defending her country. Those details were inconvenient, unprofitable, impossible to turn into social media posts that would impress their friends. The hierarchy was crystal clear. Carmen was the success story, the daughter who made them proud, the one who justified their parenting and validated their choices. I was the expensive mistake, the one who'd chosen incorrectly, the reminder that sometimes children don't turn out the way parents plan. In their version of our family story, Carmen was the protagonist, and I was barely a footnote. This hierarchy extended beyond just family dynamics. It infected every aspect of how our community saw us. Carmen was Mrs. Rodriguez, the successful businesswoman transforming rural Texas. I was just Isabella, the veteran nobody really knew what to do with. But there were cracks in their perfect narrative, small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up if anyone bothered to look closely. The problem was, nobody wanted to look closely. It was easier to accept the simple story. Carmen was the responsible one. Isabella was the disappointment. Still, the signs were there for anyone paying attention. Like the way my mother's voice changed whenever someone asked about my military service. A slight tightening, a quick pivot to safer topics. "Oh, Isabella's doing well," she'd say, then immediately shift to Carmen's latest business venture or her pregnancy updates. Never details about where I'd served or what I'd done. Never any curiosity about the years I'd spent overseas. My father was even more obvious in his avoidance. At the hardware store where he'd worked for 30 years, conversations about veterans' benefits or Memorial Day events would send him shuffling toward a different aisle. When his drinking buddies shared stories about their sons and daughters in the service, he'd nod politely but never contribute. It was as if acknowledging my military career might somehow validate my claim to the farm they'd given away. The neighbors noticed too, though they were too polite to say anything directly. Mrs. Gutierrez, who'd known me since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, would ask careful questions. "How's Isabella doing? We haven't seen her around much." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother's answers were always vague. "She's keeping busy," or, "You know how it is with young people these days." But Mrs. Gutierrez remembered the little girl who used to help her grandfather fix fence posts and bottle feed orphaned calves. She remembered the teenager who'd won the county rodeo 3 years running and could outwork most grown men during harvest season. The woman my parents described unstable, unreliable, unsuited for farm life didn't match the Isabella she'd watched grow up. Even Carmen seemed uncomfortable with certain topics. At her baby shower, when someone mentioned military families and the sacrifices they make, she'd change the subject so abruptly it left an awkward silence. When her husband's business partner asked about her sister, Carmen's smile became forced. "Isabella's finding her path," she'd say, the same empty phrase my parents used, as if I were a lost college freshman instead of a decorated combat veteran. The most telling sign was what happened to my grandfather's study. After he died, his desk had remained exactly as he'd left it. Military medals from his own service in Vietnam, photos of him and me working the ranch together, letters I'd written him from overseas pinned to a corkboard. When Carmen moved in, she'd claim she was updating the space, but really she was erasing any evidence that I'd ever mattered to him. The photos disappeared first, replaced by stock art from HomeGoods. Then the letters vanished, along with the corkboard where he displayed them proudly. His Purple Heart went into storage, too painful a reminder that military service was part of our family legacy. Carmen turned his study into a nursery planning room, all pastels and baby furniture catalogs, as if children had never played in that house before. My parents never questioned these changes. They praised Carmen's decorating skills and her vision for the future. They never asked what happened to their father's things, never wondered why she felt the need to erase all traces of the granddaughter who'd been his obvious favorite. But the erasure wasn't complete. Sometimes I'd catch my mother staring at the empty spaces on the walls where my pictures used to hang. Sometimes my father would start to tell a story about me, then catch himself and trail off mid-sentence. They knew something was missing from their carefully constructed narrative, even if they refused to acknowledge what it was. What my family never knew, what they never bothered to ask about, was that Isabella Martinez wasn't just any soldier. For 6 years, I'd been part of an elite army unit that most people have never heard of, because we weren't supposed to exist. While they assumed I'd been filing paperwork at some base in Germany, I'd been leading tactical operations in the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. I was a combat engineer attached to special operations, specializing in explosive ordnance disposal and route clearance. When IEDs were too sophisticated for regular bomb disposal units, they called us. When supply convoys needed to get through territory where 3 previous teams had been ambushed, they called us. When intelligence suggested a compound was rigged with enough explosives to level a city block, they called me Oro. My grandfather would have understood. He'd earned his Purple Heart crawling through Viet Cong tunnels, dismantling booby traps that could have killed dozens of his fellow soldiers. The same hands that taught me to fix tractors and mend fence wire had once defused bombs under enemy fire. But my parents had never connected those dots, never seen the line that ran from his service to mine. Over 3 deployments, I'd led 47 high-risk missions. I'd saved countless lives by clearing routes that insurgents had turned into death traps. My team had prevented suicide bombings, dismantled weapons caches, and evacuated civilians from combat zones. The bronze star in my dresser drawer wasn't for showing up. It was for the night I'd spent 4 hours disarming a complex device in a school where Taliban fighters had barricaded themselves with hostages. But none of that appeared on my parents' social media. None of it got mentioned at church or family gatherings. None of it factored into their decision about who deserved my grandfather's farm. As far as they knew, I'd just been in the army for a while, playing around with guns while Carmen was building a real life. The irony was crushing. While Carmen was learning to manage a wedding business, I was managing life and death situations that required split-second decisions and absolute precision. While she was networking at Chamber of Commerce meetings, I was coordinating with intelligence officers and special forces commanders. While she was decorating the farmhouse, I was clearing buildings room by room, ensuring they were safe for medical teams and refugees. My military records told a different story than the one my family had written about me. Commendations for leadership under fire, recommendations for advanced training programs, requests from commanding officers who wanted me on their teams for the most dangerous assignments. I turned down officer training twice because I preferred working in the field, preferred the hands-on problem-solving that reminded me of my grandfather's lessons about fixing what was broken. The skills that made me invaluable in combat were the same ones my grandfather had taught me on the ranch. Reading terrain, thinking 3 steps ahead, staying calm under pressure, understanding that sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters. He'd trained me for leadership without knowing it, teaching me that taking care of people and property required both courage and competence. But my family saw only the surface. A daughter who'd chosen military service over marriage, who'd left Texas instead of staying close to home, who'd picked an uncertain future over the safe path they'd mapped out for me. They never asked about the medals, never wanted to hear about the missions, never considered that my military experience might have actually prepared me to run a ranch better than any business degree ever could. The cost of my service went far beyond what any paycheck could measure, but my family never understood the true price I'd paid for wearing the uniform. They saw only what they wanted to see. A daughter who'd chosen poorly, who'd wasted years that could have been spent building the kind of life they valued. What they didn't know was that I came home different each time, not broken but changed in ways that civilian life couldn't accommodate. After my first deployment, I'd startle at backfiring cars and crowded spaces. After my second, I couldn't sleep through the night without checking every entrance to my apartment twice. After my third, I'd developed a hypervigilance that made family dinners feel like tactical situations requiring constant threat assessment. The nightmares weren't something you discussed over Sunday barbecue. The faces of the insurgents I'd killed, the sounds of wounded soldiers calling for help, the weight of making decisions that meant life or death for people I'd never met, none of that fit into polite conversation with parents who thought my biggest challenge was choosing between different job offers. I'd lost relationships because I couldn't explain why I needed to sit facing the door in restaurants or why sudden loud noises made me reach for weapons that weren't there. I'd missed birthdays and holidays not because I didn't care, but because I was disarming bombs in places my family couldn't pronounce. I'd watched friends die in ways that haunted my sleep, and left me questioning whether coming home at all was worth the survivor's guilt that followed. The physical scars were easier to hide. The shrapnel scar on my left shoulder from an IED that detonated too close. The burns on my hands from a chemical fire I'd had to crawl through to reach wounded civilians. The hearing loss in my right ear from the explosion that earned me the Bronze Star. My parents never noticed these marks because they never looked closely enough to see them. But the deeper wounds were the ones that really cost me the farm. My family needed their children to be predictable, manageable, easy to understand and explain to others. I'd come back from war with edges they couldn't smooth over, with experiences they couldn't relate to, with a perspective that made their social gatherings feel trivial and their priorities seem shallow. When my grandfather was dying, I'd been on a classified mission that I couldn't leave. I'd spent his last weeks coordinating explosive ordnance disposal in a region where our intelligence suggested a major attack was imminent. While Carmen held his hand and promised to take care of the farm, I was preventing a bombing that would have killed hundreds of Afghan civilians. I chose duty over family, and that choice cost me everything. Every doma, nearly. The guilt from that decision nearly destroyed me. I'd replay those final weeks constantly, wondering if I could have found a way to come home, if my presence might have changed his mind about the farm, if being there would have reminded him of the promises he'd made about keeping the land in my hands. But classified missions don't allow for personal emergencies, and my grandfather died believing I'd chosen the army over him. My family never understood that military service isn't a job you leave at the office. It's a commitment that reshapes everything about who you are and how you see the world. They expected me to come home and seamlessly transition back into the daughter they remembered. But that girl had been forged into someone else entirely by fire and loss and responsibilities they couldn't imagine. The Isabella who returned from Afghanistan was stronger, more capable, and infinitely more qualified to run a working ranch than the college graduate they'd sent away. But she was also harder, quieter, and less willing to pretend that family loyalty was more important than duty. That transformation terrified them, so they chose the daughter who'd stayed safely unchanged over the one who'd grown into someone they couldn't control or fully comprehend. For 3 years after losing the farm, I watched my family construct an elaborate fiction about who I was and why I'd failed to measure up. Their version of my story became the accepted truth in our small community, repeated so often that even I sometimes wondered if they were right about me. At the grocery store, I'd overhear my mother talking to neighbors about Carmen's latest success. The wedding venue was booked solid, the cattle operation was turning a profit, the subdivision development was attracting buyers from Austin. When someone politely asked about me, her tone would shift to that careful mixture of disappointment and resignation that parents use when discussing their problem children. "Isabella's still finding her way," she'd say with a practiced sigh. "Military life is hard to adjust from, you know. She's working construction now, trying to get back on her feet." The subtext was clear. I was struggling, unstable, unable to handle civilian responsibilities, the successful military career, the decorations, the leadership experience. None of that existed in her narrative. My father was even more direct in his dismissal. At the VFW hall, where he'd drink beer with other veterans on Friday nights, he'd nod along when they shared proud stories about their children's service, but he never contributed any stories about mine. When pressed, he'd mumble something about how some kids just can't settle down after the service, and quickly change the subject to safer topics like football or local politics. The community absorbed these explanations without question. It was easier to believe that I'd somehow failed at military life than to consider that my parents might have made a mistake about the farm. The narrative fit their expectations. The wild daughter who'd left home had predictably crashed and burned, while the responsible daughter who'd stayed close had predictably succeeded. Carmen played her part perfectly, offering concerned updates about my struggles whenever anyone asked. She'd share carefully curated information about my modest apartment, my blue-collar jobs, my apparent inability to maintain relationships or build wealth. She spoke about me with the patronizing sympathy reserved for family members who'd made poor life choices, as if my circumstances were evidence of some fundamental character flaw rather than the deliberate financial consequences of their inheritance decision. "We've offered to help," Carmen would tell people, "but Isabella's too proud to accept it. She wants to make it on her own." This fiction allowed them to appear generous while explaining why I remained excluded from family gatherings and business discussions. They'd rewritten history so that I was the one rejecting them, not the other way around. The most painful misrepresentations came during patriotic holidays. While other families celebrated their veterans with pride, mine treated my service like an embarrassing phase I'd gone through. On Veterans Day, when the local newspaper ran features about community heroes, Carmen would be quoted talking about supporting our troops, but my own combat record was never mentioned. My Bronze Star might as well have been a participation trophy for all the recognition it received from the people who should have been proudest. Divaki Church was particularly difficult. Our pastor would regularly honor military families, asking veterans to stand while the congregation applauded. I'd remain seated, not because I was ashamed of my service, but because standing felt like claiming recognition my own family refused to acknowledge. My parents would clap politely for other families' heroes while pretending their own daughter had never earned the right to similar honor. The strangest part was how completely they'd erased the grandfather who'd shaped me. The man who'd taught me everything about hard work, loyalty, and protecting what mattered was somehow forgotten in their calculations about my worthiness. They'd chosen to remember only the dutiful son who'd stayed close to home, not the Purple Heart recipient who'd understood what military service really meant. In their revised family history, my grandfather's influence on me had been reduced to teaching me stubbornness rather than courage. By year 3 of my exile, I'd reached a kind of numb acceptance of my situation. Working double shifts in construction and security had become routine. Living paycheck to paycheck in my cramped apartment felt normal. Being erased from family photos and holiday celebrations was just another fact of life, like Texas heat or morning traffic. I'd stopped expecting phone calls and started building a life that didn't depend on their approval or recognition. But isolation has a way of wearing you down, especially when you're used to being part of a team. In the military, I'd been surrounded by people who understood sacrifice, who valued competence over comfort, who measured worth by what you contributed rather than what you accumulated. In civilian life, I was just another working-class veteran trying to make ends meet, invisible to the middle-class world my family inhabited. The breaking point started building on a Tuesday night in November. I'd been working security at a downtown office building, pulling a 12-hour shift to cover for a coworker whose kid was sick. During my rounds, I stopped by the convenience store across the street to grab coffee and a lottery ticket. Not because I believed in luck, but because the $2 purchase was my only indulgence, a tiny rebellion against the careful budgeting that governed every other aspect of my life. The clerk, an older Vietnamese man named Mr. Nguyen, had become a friend of sorts. He'd served in the South Vietnamese army before fleeing to America, and he recognized something in me that reminded him of his own military experience. We talk sometimes about the weight of memories, about adjusting to civilian life, about the particular loneliness that comes from being a warrior in a world that doesn't understand war. "Same numbers again?" he asked, holding up the lottery payslip I'd been using for months. "Same numbers," I confirmed. They were coordinates from my grandfather's farm, the exact location where he'd taught me to shoot, translated into lottery digits. It was my way of keeping him close, even though his land now belonged to someone else. That week, everything seemed to accelerate towards some inevitable collision. Carmen posted photos from the farm's harvest festival, an event she'd created to attract more wedding clients. Dozens of families posed in front of my grandfather's barn, paying for the authentic ranch experience that my sister was now packaging and selling. The comments were full of praise for her creativity and business sense, with my parents adding their own proud responses about their entrepreneur daughter. Meanwhile, I'd been dealing with my own crisis. The construction company I worked for had lost a major contract, and layoffs were coming. My landlord had raised the rent on my apartment, pricing me out of the only stability I'd managed to build. I was facing the possibility of having to leave San Antonio entirely, maybe heading north to find work in the oil fields, or east to try construction in Houston. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carmen was throwing parties on land that was supposed to be mine, while I was contemplating whether I could afford to stay in the same state. She was building wealth from my inheritance while I was calculating whether I could afford both groceries and gas for the week. Friday night, I stopped by Mr. Nguyen's store after another exhausting shift. The lottery drawing was that evening, and I almost didn't check my numbers. It seemed pointless, like everything else in my life lately. But Mr. Nguyen insisted, pulling up the winning numbers on his phone with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed good things could happen to good people. "Check your ticket," he said, smiling. "Maybe tonight your luck changes." I looked at the numbers, then looked again. Then I sat down heavily on the plastic chair beside the counter and stared at the impossible match between my grandfather's coordinates and the $47 million jackpot I'd just won. The news broke on a Sunday morning. Local veteran wins $47 million lottery jackpot splashed across the front page of the San Antonio Express News, complete with a photo of me holding the oversized check at the lottery office. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional networks. By evening, it was trending on social media with hashtags about veterans and second chances. I'd spent the week since, winning in a surreal bubble, meeting with financial advisors and lawyers, learning about tax implications and investment strategies. I'd taken the lump sum, $28 million after taxes, and quietly purchased a sprawling ranch outside Austin, complete with a main house that rivaled anything Carmen had done to our grandfather's place. But I'd kept the news private, sharing it only with Mr. Nguyen and the small circle of veteran friends who'd become my chosen family. Then the Lottery Commission's publicity department got involved. They wanted their winner's story for marketing purposes, and a female combat veteran striking it rich was exactly the kind of narrative they needed. I'd agreed to one photo and a brief interview, thinking it would be contained to local news. I hadn't anticipated how quickly the story would spread, or how dramatically it would shatter the careful fiction my family had constructed about my life. The first contact came exactly 18 minutes after the newspaper hit stands. A text from Carmen. "Oh my God, is this real? Please call me." Then my mother. "Sweetheart, we saw the news. We're so proud of you." Then my father. "Isabella, we need to talk. This is incredible." 3 years of silence, broken by $47 million. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat in my new kitchen, granite countertops, professional appliances, windows overlooking rolling hills that reminded me of grandfather's land, and read the flood of messages pouring in. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me since high school suddenly wanted to reconnect. Former neighbors expressed their excitement about my blessing. Family friends who'd watched my parents dismiss me for years now praised my perseverance and good fortune. But it was the voicemail from my mother that really exposed everything. Her voice bright with artificial warmth, she gushed about how proud the family was, how they'd always known I was special, how they couldn't wait to celebrate together. "We should plan a family dinner at the farm," she suggested. "Carmen's been wanting to have you over, and now we have such wonderful news to celebrate." The rewriting of history was breathtaking in its audacity. Suddenly, I was the daughter they'd always supported. Suddenly, my struggles had been evidence of character building rather than family abandonment. Suddenly, the farm they'd given to Carmen was being offered as a venue for my celebration, as if they were doing me a favor by allowing me to visit my own grandfather's land. The media attention intensified when a reporter dug deeper into my military background. By Wednesday, news outlets were running features about the decorated combat veteran who'd won the lottery using coordinates from her family's ranch. The Bronze Star, the multiple deployments, the specialized training, all the accomplishments my family had ignored were now public record, painting a picture of a hero who'd been living in modest circumstances despite her extraordinary service. That's when the real flood began. Carmen called 6 times in one day. My parents showed up at my old apartment building, confused when the landlord told them I'd moved out without leaving a forwarding address. Church members who'd never acknowledged my existence started posting on social media about how blessed our family was. Neighbors began sharing stories about the quiet veteran they'd always known was special. Clattrust was stunning. For 3 years, I'd been the family disappointment. Too unstable for responsibility, too damaged for success. Now, with $47 million validating my worth, I was suddenly the pride of the Martinez family, the daughter they'd always believed in, the veteran hero they'd always celebrated. Money hadn't changed who I was, but it had certainly changed how clearly everyone else could see me. The family reunion they orchestrated was a masterpiece of delusion and desperation. 2 weeks after the news broke, my parents organized what they called a celebration dinner at Carmen's house, my grandfather's house, complete with a hand-painted banner reading, "Congratulations, Isabella," stretched across the front porch where I'd learned to tie my shoes. I almost didn't go. For days, I'd ignored their increasingly frantic calls and messages, each one more elaborate in its attempts to rewrite our history. My mother left voicemails describing how worried they'd been about me, how they'd always hoped I'd find success, how the family had been planning to reach out even before the lottery win. My father sent a text about being proud of his military daughter, as if he'd spent the last 3 years bragging about my service instead of pretending it didn't exist. But curiosity won out over anger. I wanted to see how far they'd take this performance, how completely they could convince themselves that their sudden interest in me was genuine rather than financial. So I drove to the farm in my new truck, a modest pickup, nothing flashy, because old habits die hard even when you're suddenly wealthy. The scene that greeted me was surreal. Carmen had decorated like it was my birthday party, complete with balloons and a cake featuring an edible photo of me in my military dress uniform, the same uniform she'd never asked to see when I actually served. My parents beamed like proud peacocks, taking photos for social media, narrating my arrival as if I were a returning hero rather than the daughter they'd systematically excluded for years. "There she is," my mother announced, arms spread wide for an embrace I hadn't received since before my first deployment. "Our lottery winner. Our hero." The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were the same people who'd sat me down 3 years ago to explain why I wasn't responsible enough to inherit my grandfather's farm. Now they were presenting me to extended family members as if I were their greatest achievement, their proof that the Martinez family raised exceptional children. Carmen's performance was particularly elaborate. She'd prepared a speech about how proud she was of her sister's perseverance, how she'd always known I was destined for great things, how family meant supporting each other through all of life's challenges. She presented me with a photo album she'd supposedly been keeping all along, pictures of my military ceremonies, newspaper clippings about local veterans, even printouts of my social media posts from deployment. Evidence of the support and pride she'd never actually shown, but the most revealing moment came during dinner, when my father raised his glass for a toast. "To Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion that felt both genuine and calculated, "who has always made us proud, even when times were tough. Your grandfather would be so happy to see you succeed like this." The invocation of my grandfather hit like a physical blow. This was the same man they'd claimed I wasn't worthy to remember, whose farm they'd decided I couldn't handle, whose legacy they'd handed to Carmen because I was too unstable and unreliable. Now they were using his memory to validate their fake pride in my success. I watched their faces around the table. Cousins, aunts, uncles, who'd absorbed the narrative about my failures and were now struggling to reconcile it with this new version of events. Some looked confused, clearly remembering the years of dismissive comments about my choices. Others seemed relieved to have permission to acknowledge my achievements. A few appeared genuinely ashamed, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in my exile. The breaking point came when Carmen suggested we take a family photo in front of my grandfather's portrait, the same portrait she'd moved to a closet when she redecorated his study. "For the Christmas cards," she said brightly, "everyone will want to see our successful family together." That's when I finally spoke up. "Successful family?" I repeated, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of silence. "Is that what we're calling this?" The room went quiet. The performance stopped. And for the first time since winning the lottery, I saw something real in their faces. The recognition that their sudden transformation from dismissive to devoted wasn't fooling anyone, least of all me. They'd revealed their true values so clearly that no amount of retroactive affection could hide the fact that my worth to them was measured entirely in dollars. The silence that followed my question stretched long enough for everyone to understand that the charade was over. I stood up from the dinner table, my grandfather's dinner table, and looked around the room at faces that had suddenly lost their artificial brightness. It was time for some truth. "Let me tell you what a successful family looks like," I said, my voice steady and calm. "A successful family doesn't wait for a lottery win to remember they have a daughter. A successful family doesn't hand away someone's inheritance and then pretend it was for their own good. A successful family doesn't spend 3 years erasing someone from their story and then act surprised when that person doesn't want to be rewritten back in." My mother's face crumpled. "Isabella, we never meant—" "You never meant to get caught," I interrupted. "You meant every dismissive comment, every excluded holiday, every time you introduced me as your other daughter who couldn't settle down. You meant it when you decided Carmen deserved grandfather's farm because she married the right man and I chose the wrong career. You just didn't mean for it to matter when I had money." Carmen tried to speak, but I held up my hand. "I know you're going to say you always supported me, that you kept those photos and clippings because you cared. But supporting someone means calling them on their birthday, not when they win the lottery. It means defending their choices to neighbors, not explaining them away. It means being proud of their service when they're sleeping in a cramped apartment, not just when they're buying mansions." I pulled out my phone and showed them photos of my new ranch. The sprawling house, the restored barn, the rolling pastures that looked remarkably like the land they'd given away. "This is what $47 million bought me," I said. "Land that looks like home but without the family that made the original feel like exile." My father's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" "I wanted you to ask about my service when it mattered. I wanted you to trust that grandfather taught me something valuable about responsibility and land stewardship. I wanted you to measure my worth by my character instead of my bank account. But mostly I wanted you to love me when I had nothing to offer but myself." The room was heavy with the weight of 3 years of missed opportunities and deliberate blindness. I could see them struggling to process the magnitude of what they'd lost. Not just a daughter with money, but a daughter, period. "I'm not angry anymore," I continued, and I realized it was true. Anger requires hope that things could be different. I'm just tired of pretending we're something we're not. But then something unexpected happened. Carmen started crying. Not the performative tears of someone caught in manipulation, but the ugly, honest sobs of genuine remorse. "I never wanted the farm," she whispered. "I took it because they offered it, but I knew it should have been yours. I've felt guilty every single day." My mother spoke next, her voice breaking. "We were scared of who you'd become in the military. You seemed so different, so independent. We thought if we couldn't understand you, we couldn't trust you with something as important as the family land. So you punished me for growing stronger instead of asking me to help you understand what that strength could do for our family," I replied. My father nodded slowly. We made the safe choice instead of the right choice. We chose what was comfortable over what was fair. The admission hung in the air like smoke, clearing the atmosphere but leaving its mark. For the first time in years, we were having an honest conversation, instead of performing scripted roles. Kisfai sighed. I made them an offer that surprised even me. I'm not giving anyone money, I said clearly. But I am willing to start over. Not where we left off, but from the beginning. As people who are learning to know each other without assumptions or expectations. It wasn't forgiveness. That would take time. It wasn't reconciliation. That would require them to prove they'd changed. But it was a door left open, a possibility for something real to grow, where only performance had existed. But one patient. Some relationships can't be repaired, only rebuilt. Mine with my family was one of those. The money had revealed who they really were, but it had also forced them to confront the cost of their choices. Whether they'd prove worthy of a second chance remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 years, I was willing to find out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.